This week we'll be discussing the structure of English orthography, and I want to separate this from morphology because morphology is vocabulary, it's a very language-based concept, and orthography is language-based, but it's related to the phonemes or phonology. It's also related to the morphology or meaning, and it's related to the sounds and the letter representations they make. A short way of saying this, or a common vernacular term, might be phonics. This is essentially what phonics instruction is and the foundations of phonics and how to know how to teach reading instruction and the rules governing our spelling. Um, so I thought it was important that we focused on just this concept for this week. So orthography. Again, orthography is a written language system. It's the representation of the phonemes to a grapheme. English orthography can be explained if history and other factors are taken into account. There's a conception out there that English spelling makes no sense whatsoever because you have all of these various different spellings for the long vowel E's or the short vowels. And there's a reason that the spellings differ. And you have to consider historical factors. You have to consider positions of the phonemes in the words. You have to consider the meaning of the words behind it. So we're going to discuss all of that in this chapter. So first one in consideration is word origin and history. Then you need to consider the phoneme grapheme correspondence. So a phoneme is, of course, the sound it makes. A grapheme is the letter that represents the sound. You need to consider position constraints or effective position on spelling, which we'll get into in a little bit. You need to consider patterns of letter sequence and use, and then morphology are the meaningful parts, the spelling of the meaningful parts. And morphology will be more in depth in next week's discussion. For the history of writing, writing hasn't been around since the beginning of time. It only evolved about 20,000 years ago. And so if we take into account what we think we know about how long humans have been around, then writing was a later developing skill of our human history. The first form of written any communication was pictograms. And these were basically pictures of things that are happening. And I don't know if you've ever had the opportunity to travel out west to some of the Indian ruins, but there are some very cool pictograms that we can see from our Native American culture in the United States. And of course, we're all familiar with those caveman drawings that you'll see on television on the National Geographic or Smithsonian Channel. From pictograms evolved ideographic writing systems, which were stylized pictograms, and these were used to represent ideas and words rather than concrete depictions of events. From there, it moved to cuneiform script, which you've heard of cuneiform before, and it's a stylized, simplified representations of words and ideas. And they also were the first syllabaries, meaning that they represented syllables of speech instead of just the whole concept or word or picture of a word. So when we started breaking things down from the whole word, the whole concept to the syllable level, we moved more towards that phoneme level, which we have today. Next for hieroglyphics, of course, the Egyptians. We're so very familiar with this. This developed about 4000 BC, so you must think about 6,000, 7,000 years ago, which was 13,000 years after the pictogram. So look at how long it's taking the language to evolve into different forms of written systems. So hieroglyphics were syllables of words, so that each symbol represented a certain syllable. And this can be seen across other cultures besides just the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, other Mediterranean cultures. And then finally we move to the alphabetic system, which the Greeks used, and they assigned a symbol to each consonant and vowel. Alpha and beta being the first two letters of the Greek symbol system. And of course, we would think alpha and then omega being the final letter of the Greek system. So this insight that words can be broken into phonemes and represented with symbols is elusive for the human brain because it took us tens of thousands of years, essentially, to develop this idea that we can represent each sound we're making by a single grapheme or a single group of graphemes that represent that concept. So meaning and sound. The alphabetic writing systems, they can be either transparent or opaque. And again, our system is alphabetic writing systems. There are still very much other symbolic or syllabary systems in place today. For instance, Chinese or Japanese, they might represent whole words or concepts in their symbols or syllables. So, but of course, English is an alphabetic writing system, like more Greek-based languages such as English, French, and Italian and Spanish. So they can be either transparent or opaque, and from shallow to deep. English is deep and opaque, and because it is morphophonic, meaning that it represents sound and meaning. So our symbols that we have, our graphemes, don't represent just the sound that the letters make. It also can represent meaning. For instance, look at the ending of ing. We're not only knowing that ing makes that ing sound, we're also realizing that ing carries the meaning of present progressive tense. And again, we'll talk about this more when we move into morphology, but that's an important concept to understand, is that it's morpho, meaning morphology, and phonemic is the meaning and the sounds combined together. And this actually led linguist Chomsky to describe English as an optimal system for a reader, because we have meaningful parts of words spelled consistently, although pronunciation may be difficult and not easily recovered from the print. So essentially, if we know enough about the background of words, about the word origin, history, positioning, influence, beyond just the rules of I before E or subject after C or other types of phonics rules that we learned, then we're going to have a greater understanding of the word meaning and know what the word means when we come to it if it's an unfamiliar word. So understanding word meaning, word origin, word history, and positioning helps greatly increase your ability as a reader. And I always think about, if I had known what I know now when I was in undergraduate school and when I was getting ready and preparing to take the GRE, and you as new graduate students I know can understand this, how stressful that was to prepare for that and try to get that high score, especially on that vocabulary measure or whatever it was that you were taking. If you had the knowledge when you complete your studies as an SLP, when you were doing that vocabulary test, you would have blown it out of the park. I know I would have, because I did not know and realize how much word origin, history, meaning influence spelling. If I'd known this, I'd be able to complete those word analogies that were so frequent on those types of tests. The SAT is another test that's notorious for that. So think about that about our students in the 21st century and 21st century learning. How do we give them those strategies that will make them better learners of concepts and dissecting words to understand meaning, not just sound related? Because I'm a product of a sound related reading system where you only get a sound letter association, and that's insufficient. If you only teach children the sounds letters make, they won't be proficient spellers or linguistic understanders of the concepts that we're teaching them as far as the language of our written language. All right, that probably didn't make much sense, but it will make sense when it all comes together in the end. All right. English has the richest vocabulary and the most options for expressing abstract ideas and shades of meaning. So because our language is deep or opaque, it makes learning to read a challenge, but it also makes our vocabulary and our English system one of the best for being able to select multiple words to express our meaning. We don't just say I'm happy. You can say I'm ecstatic, I'm elated, I'm other words meaning joyful, So there's so many different word options that we have because we're so influenced by not just one history, but multiple histories. So what are our histories of word origin that are influencing our English language? There are three major languages that influence English, modern English. The first being Anglo-Saxon roots. So Anglo-Saxon was essentially Old English and Middle English that moved into modern English. This would be English as close as we can get to modern English. So most common words in English and function words are of Anglo-Saxon roots. They're very often one-syllable words, and they use a lot of vowel teams, silent letters, and diagraphs because originally when they were speaking these vowels, the vowels were elongated. They were longer. They were held longer in speech back in Old English. But the church influenced the written language back when only scholars and religious leaders were using a written language system. So, of course, the church being origins in middle Mediterranean area with that heavy Greek influence from the Mesopotamian period and Constantinople, whenever he mandated that all of essentially the Middle East, Greek, Turkey area would be Christian. So that was when the Catholic Church grew very largely. And of course, this is before Christianity separated into beyond just the Catholic Church, into the Protestant versus the Catholics. So the Catholic Church Christianity was expanding. The religious leaders were the ones who were writing. Instead, they were bringing the Greek influence to them, and they were using the Roman alphabet, which had 26 letters, but only 5 of which were vowels. And then some vowels were shorter in duration than others. You never knew you had to know as much about history and speech pathology before you got here. So there is a lot to know and understand in our historical roots about how it's influenced our English language. So this is how we get words like said, which is spelled S-A-I-D, because said in Old English or Middle English, I don't know exactly how it probably was pronounced, but it's definitely pronounced differently than it is today, because we pronounce it with a short, as we call it in phonics language, vowel sound. But it was elongated, which is why you had those 2 vowels there to represent that sound. So those Anglo-Saxon roots, they're very heavily influencing our language. And again, most of our function words, our articles, our pronouns, the 100 most frequently occurring words in English all have Anglo-Saxon roots. Okay, so then we move into French and Latin layers of the English language. So once that church influence was there and they were using the Roman alphabet, then you started seeing a lot of Latin influence as well, because that was the language of the church. So it was a language of scholars, nobles, and the high social class. And usually those with the money and the power are the ones that are making the rules. So therefore, we get all these Latin influences. This is where we get that soft C and soft G origin from the French. And it all has to do with the position of the vowels around the C's and the G's. But the French influenced the pronunciation of those, because before that, in Anglo-Saxon, they were just k and g. They were not s and j. In French, there are words for food, fashion, abstract social ideas, and relationships are all of French origin. The English words today that mean that, such as anything that ends in ein, et, l, and I'm looking at the table on 4.1 on page 84, such as croquette, coquet, mirage, debut, depot. All of those have heavily French origin. We also have the Latin influence, which has multisyllabic words with roots. And the Latin also contains content words found in academic language, such as social sciences, traditional physical sciences, and literature. So a lot of the Latin influences give us our prefixes and our suffixes because they have root word origins, and they're building their words, their multisyllabic words, around the root words with the prefixes and the suffixes. Then finally, we have the Greek influence, and this came. When we transitioned from Old English to Middle English, it can be traced to the residence of St. Augustine in Canterbury during the 10th century, so around 900 A.D. And there were all of our words that are philosophical in nature, mathematical and scientific technology. We had a lot of scientific prosperity and boom, and it says after the 15th century, so after 1400s, you think of the Romantic period in English literature, and the Elizabethan period, Shakespeare, and all the growth in science whenever you're discovering those Isaac Newton's principles and whatnot. They had to have words to describe these concepts, these abstract concepts they were talking about. So they use the Greek influence very heavily. All right. So evolution of spelling, how do we get to the spelling that we have today from those word origin roots? So because we moved from Anglo-Saxon, which is that Middle European, England, German influence, to the French Latin influence, excuse me, filtering into the English language, and then finally that Greek influence. So how does that influence our spelling? Well, we changed from Old English to Middle English around the 15th century, around Shakespeare's time. And then Middle English had 7 diphthongs, which included vowels pronounced with a glide in the middle that were spelled aw, A-U-A-W, A-I-A-Y, E-I-E-Y, U, E-U, E-W, O-I-O-Y, and O-U-O-W. So you had all those letters that were 2 vowels because, again, those sounds were elongated in that English language at that time. So they used double letters to show vowel lengthening. And I can only assume that aw, as we say, it would be like aw. And you think about these are diphthongs, your mouth is doing 2 things. One is most pronounced to me is oi. If you really pronounce oi, and I'm teaching a hearing impaired child right now, and she thinks it's the most funny thing to say oi because she watches my mouth and she's watching her mouth. And it does look funny because you go from rounded lips to spread lips. Oi, oi. And of course, in speech, we say oi very fast in modern English. And if you're in the South, you say oil instead of oil. So we're not even pronouncing that oi very clearly, and depending on what our dialect is. So, but they use these double letters to show vowel lengthening. Unaccented vowels were reduced to schwa in pronunciation because of the vowel lengthening and the stress influences of other vowels. The silent E represented a spoken final syllable. So actually, at some point, I don't know how it was pronounced, so I can only assume that time was pronounced time. Time. Very soft, probably a schwa type sound. Maybe even something you still hear in Southern English every now and then, but that is how we got the silent E in our spelling. Then it became a guide for long vowels to mark soft C and soft G and to prevent words from looking like plurals. So the soft C and soft G, it's just like page and chance. That keeps it, if we put that silent E on the end, for instance, look at page, take the silent E off of it, it looks like pag. So those certain vowels were used to protect the consonants or to mark them to show that sound was changing. And then sometimes to, of course, keep the words looking like plurals, like false and else would have looked like els and falls. So during the 15th and 16th century, it became customary to pronounce long vowels with higher tongue position, which gives us our modern English tense vowel and diphthong pronunciations. But we still preserve the spellings. So we changed our enunciation a little bit from oi to oi, really quick, a little bit quicker sound. But we didn't change the spellings. And just think how much easier, one of my colleagues said this week, think about how much easier it would be to learn how to read if we just simply use the International Phonetic Alphabet to teach reading, because it's exactly marked what sound it makes by that phonetic transcription. But we don't, and we have English, and this is why. So for some reason, when they changed the enunciation of oi to oi, they didn't change the spelling. And a lot of that had to do with they were trying to preserve the English spelling and the English language because, as you can see, English was constantly changing. So in 1690, the New England Primer, the first American primer for children, came out. And it has very similar spellings to what we have today. So not a lot has changed from that late 17th century publication. Now, Samuel Johnson in 1755 published the first modern English dictionary. So this is the first dictionary that we can establish as what we consider now today modern English. It's been around for about 300-400 years. That fixed orthographic patterns, usage, origin, and meaning of words, which you can see now influence heavily in the dictionaries that we use today. And English is heavily influenced by word origins, which is why you always see those spelling contests or spelling bees on TV. What's the word of origin? They ask that question to know the spelling because they know how greatly word origin influences more so than pronunciation. Really, how we say words does not accurately reflect how they're spelled. It's better to know word origin, positions of sounds, and how they're influenced by the letters and graphemes around them to know how to spell words and understand words than it is to just listen to it and sound it out phonetically, because it's most of the time it's probably not going to match. And we'll get to those statistics in a little while. So phoneme graphing correspondence. How do they match up? We know that phoneme graphing is the building blocks of orthographic code. The phoneme, of course, being the sound, the graphing being the letter representation or any letter or letter combination that corresponds to one phoneme or sound in a printed word. It's a relational or functional unit to represent an element of speech and the symbol for a phoneme. Now, graphemes can be letter combinations that can spell certain phonemes, such as th for th or sh for sh. And not all languages have multiple graphemes to for those sounds. Even if you look at their alphabet, they might have sh within their alphabet instead of us having to make that combination as we do in English. So again, English, we have 26 letters, 44 phonemes, is the general consensus. Now, graphemes may be one letter, 2 letters, 3 letters, or 4 letters. So we're throwing a little complication in there for children as well, that no, sometimes the j sound is just J. And sometimes j is D, G, E, 3 letters. And sometimes they have multiple spellings. So E can be spelled EE or it can be spelled EA. And for those of you who've done the DeBard Association Method training at Southern Miss, you're familiar with the Hawthorne symbols because it teaches their primary spellings, which is the most frequently occurring spelling. Then it teaches secondary and secondary spellings and even third, sometimes even maybe a fourth type of spelling that might occur for certain sounds in our, and that's the whole concept behind it, that there's more than one way to represent a certain sound, a lot of it being governed by word origin, their morphology or meaning, and the positioning and influences of the surrounding consonants, phonemes, and graphemes. So what types of graphemes are there? So they can be broken down into consonants and vowels like you generally learn when you're learning how to spell. English has more than 250 graphemes when you take in all the combinations to spell the 44 phonemes of English. Again, if we just use the 44 phonetic symbols for the 44 phonemes, life would be so much easier. But that's not the world that we live in, and I'm not sure it ever will be. So we are dealing with 250 for 44 sounds. So, but reading's not just a memorization of the sound to the graphemes. It's a convergent process whereby we map, and that's important to remember, you're mapping pathways in the brain. It's a limited set of sounds onto various spellings or graphemes. So what kind of graphemes do we have? In consonant graphemes, we have single consonant letters, consonant digraphs, such as CH and SH, consonant trigraphs like TCH and DGE. We have silent letter consonant doubles, BT, GN, KN, and we have silent letter consonant spelling, and we have consonant blends. But these really shouldn't be grouped into consonant graphemes because they're not one sound but two combined. But oftentimes in teaching you might see SL taught together or SP taught together. You'll see them teaching blends, and they teach blends as one concept instead of, hey, these are two sounds. Okay? Then we have vowel graphemes, and the vowels get a little bit more complicated because, again, we have 5 vowels and 21 consonants, and so we have less to work with the vowels, but not necessarily less sounds. So vowels, we have single vowel letters, which of course are the easiest. Those are basically your short, aka short vowels. You have the vowel consonant E patterns, silent E, we're all very familiar with that. Then you have the vowel teams, so E dash, E consonant E, I consonant E, A consonant E, that's A-R-E, E-R-E, I-R-E. So they have I'm sorry, I'm looking at, vowel teams, it's like, are diphthongs. So vowel teams, EE, like I said before, EA. Now, EA can say E, but EA can also say eh. It all depends on the word, the context, the origin, the meaning, all these things that you're going to hear me say over and over again. And if we give students all these strategies, they're going to be able to attack those words that are not familiar to them using the multiple methods they know to decode or figure out what the sounds are. And then we have the vowel R combinations or R control vowels. ER, AR, OR, UR, and IR. So, and we need to have this concept that sometimes, as I mentioned before, letters are used as markers. They don't have a direct relation to the sounds themselves, but they signal the sound of other letters. Such as the example the book uses, the K in picnicking comes because if we didn't have the K attached to the C for ing, it would make these picnicing because C and then an I combination makes the C make the soft sound instead of the hard sound. And I was just teaching this concept to my second graders 2 weeks ago. They were talking about hard C, soft C. When does it say what? And I asked students, and this was the whole class. So, can y'all tell me what's the rule? How do you know if it says hard C or soft C? And none of them can tell me because they were just decoding the words and distinguishing whether it was a hard C or a soft C instead of saying, oh, okay, if it's and this is the rule. If a C is followed by an A, an O, or a U, it's going to be the hard C. Ka, ka, ka. If a C is followed by an E or an I, it's the soft C. And so that's the distinction. And there's a similar rule for the J sound as well. So sometimes you have to add a consonant to a word to protect the consonant that is surrounding from making a sound that it's not supposed to. Another book, like the G, to keep the G from sounding like J, as a guess, because we don't, if we had G-E-S-S, that would say Jess, because G followed by an E says the soft G sound, J, and not G. And again, remember, this is that French influence of word origin. So sometimes consonants act as markers, vowels as well. And then sometimes we just have odd consonants. English sometimes assigns letters to unusual roles by recruiting vowel letters to protect consonants, consonants to protect vowels, and letter combinations that differentiate similar words. So again, this is marking, and you're going to group things together to protect what it's surrounding. We have some versatile letters, X, W, U, Y. X pronunciation depends on stress, and it's the only single letter that represents two sounds. Every other letter that represents every other two sound combination is represented by at least two letters. U is a consonant when it corresponds to the W. It's a vowel by itself, and it's a marker to protect the G and make it from making it the soft G instead of the hard C, the hard G rather. So yeah, the U as corresponding to W as in quack, or assuage, or language, one of our frequently occurring words. The W is a consonant by itself, or it can be part of a vowel team, such as ow or o, all again depending on the meaning. And the ow or the o will usually depend on whether the syllable is open or closed. Then Y is a consonant. It's one of three vowel sounds alone, or it can be part of a vowel team. So think about Y says I, Y says I, and Y says E. Now, soft C and soft G, again, depends on the vowel that follows it. And C was followed by E or I, and G, if it's followed by E, Y, or I, it makes the soft G sound. And C as well, if it's followed by Y, makes the soft C sound. So it all depends on the vowel that follows it. And I remember this was an aha moment for me, going, oh, all I ever learned was I before E except after C. I never knew why C said K sometimes and why C says sometimes. I don't even know if when I was being taught how to read, if they called it hard C and soft C, because I don't remember learning that rule per se. I probably did. It's been a terminology that's been around for a while. But all that to say is that was one of my aha moments learning this as I went through the letters training. It was the end of my first year out of grad school. I had just completed my CFY, and my school district sent all of the teachers and their SPED personnel as part of the Reading First grant to receive this letters training, which is Louisa Moat's intensive 5-day training on the 5 linguistic principles that govern reading. Fluency, comprehension, phonological awareness, phonics, and vocabulary. So you spend a day on each subject. So when we're doing phonics, and I'm, of course, a young, new SLP, I said, oh, I've got this. I know all this stuff. except maybe the phonics. I'm really not that familiar with that. That's the only one I felt uncomfortable with. And boy, when I got in there and started learning these concepts and these rules that we're spending this week discussing in our chapter, I was dumbfounded. I could not believe no one had ever taught me why we say things the way that we say it and spell it the way that we do, because it just wasn't part of our reading instruction in the 80s and even 90s when I was learning how to read. And I doubt it was part of your reading instruction either. You might start seeing the products of this reading instruction changes of children who were instructed in the early mid to late 2000s, but I don't know if we're there yet really in our reading instructions. So again, hard C, soft C, and those vowels that follow rule was just such an aha moment for me, and I hope that you've had an aha moment in exploring this chapter. All right, moving on. Graphemes for vowel phonemes. They are short vowels or more predictable than longer vowels. Essentially, they almost always say that short vowel sound. Now, then we can do phoneme grapheme mapping, which is the process of matching letters and letter groups by the phonemes that they represent. And this is a very important concept to get, that we learn that TH says every time, or every time. Voiced or voiceless, of course, depending on the vowel that follows it, whether it's voiced or voiceless, or the placement and the syllable, but learning that process of what sound to associate with that letter. Then we need systematic and explicit instruction to take the guesswork out of phoneme grapheme instruction, which is, in other words, phonics. Children need phonics instruction. They need that system in place to teach them explicitly what all of this means. Okay, so we do have spellings that are determined by the position of a phoneme of word. We're moving on from word origin and from the direct phoneme grapheme correspondence. So the position of a word, the position of the phoneme in the word, or the letter sequences in a word, and the stress patterns in a syllable affect how phonemes are spelled. For instance, at the end of a syllable following an accented short vowel, CK is the preferred spelling for K. We know after the short vowel we use the CK spelling. And in general, we don't see K at the end of the word if it is a short vowel. It would always usually be CK. QU is always occurs before a vowel. And that's something we did learn in school, that we are always going to follow QU with a specific vowel. C or K used at the beginning of syllables is determined based on the phoneme that follows it. Remember that vowel that follows it, A, O, or U is going, and Y. Sorry, is going to be A, O, and U are going to be C. Like cat, caught, cut. So that hard C sound. And then the soft C is E, I, and Y. K is never going to be used to spell a consonant blend. We're always going to be using C to spell the blends. And then CH for K is used for words of Greek origin. So that's how the origin is influencing that word positioning, where we have it like it's chorus or orchestra. Now, short vowels attract consonants. How can a vowel attract a consonant, you say? Well, extra consonants wrap around a vowel inside a closed syllable and prevent it from bursting forth with its name. So when we say a vowel says its name, i.e. the long vowel, then we surround it by extra consonants to make it say that short vowel. It's called the floss rule, or FLS letter doubling pattern. It's the first example of attraction between short vowels and extra consonant guardians. So it has stiff and cliff, staff and chaff, versus if you had just one letter at the end for F, like on spell, it probably would say spiel. So that is why you double the double the consonants around that short vowel to protect that short vowel and keep it from saying its name. Then we also have that TCH and DGE combinations to protect the short vowels. So just imagine if you take the T away from the CH, or the D away from the GE, it's going to make it say a long word. such as judge, Judge. If we see it Juge, we're going to read it as Jude. So the D is protecting the short vowel and making it say the short vowel. Then we have vowel alternations or choice spellings. This is when vowels can be spelled differently depending if they are open or closed syllables and depending on stress or accent. And I mentioned this before. And the example they use is oi in the book on page 101. Oi is spelled O-I in the middle of a syllable, such as boil, coin, void, and hoist. But it's spelled O-Y at the end of a syllable or an open syllable, such as toy, annoy, and loyal. Same can be seen with the long E in be and me. Again, that Anglo-Saxon origin influence. You're never going to have an E alone ending unless it's that open syllable pattern, such as be and me. Then it talks a little bit about the O sound and how many of those ending in the phoneme O use a plain O spelling 148 times. OE is used 12 times and OW 74 times. So most of the time, O is going to be used at the end of an open syllable. OW 74 times. OE is going to be the least used ending for O and when it comes to spelling. And then we also know that when T and D follow O, the preferred spelling is OA, such as boat, float, goad, and load. O in the middle of an accent syllables, the ends of words, is most often spelled O consonant E, such as abode, enclose, and alone. So you see accent is influencing it, word position, whether it's at the end of the word versus the middle of the word, and stress. That's a lot to consider when you're teaching spelling, when you're learning how to spell, when you're learning how to read, when you're teaching reading, all of these influences on these words. But miraculously, children seem to pick this up. They pick it up best with systematic, explicit phonics instruction. Absolutely. But a lot of children, many if not most children, will learn to read in spite of instruction, meaning that just from high frequency exposure, they'll implicitly learn these rules. You've implicitly learned that. You haven't ever been probably taught explicitly what these things mean. You just know if you see OE on the end of the word, it's going to say O. Versus if you're trying to work a consonant, vowel, consonant, long O word, for example, let's take the word loat, a make-believe word loat. If you're going to try to work the make-believe word loat, you're going to probably attempt to spell it like that based on boat and coat rather than L-O-T-E, because coat is not how we spell coat. So our brain automatically picks up on these patterns usually, but some children need that extra step. Finally, spelling requires pattern recognition. So again, what I just said essentially, learning to code, print, and spell is not a rote visual memory process. You don't just memorize it based on how many times you see it. Now, high frequency exposure does increase your reading ability, your reading fluency, meaning that the more you read it, the more you do it, the more automatic it becomes. So you need that exposure. But memory for the letters in print is mediated by pattern recognition. You're recognizing the patterns, and print images are networked into the language system of the brain. So you're putting all these patterns together as you're reading naturally in your brain. All right, orthographic conventions. This includes patterns and correspondence larger than or independent of phoneme-grapheme relationships. So this is where the syllable influence comes into place. There's constraints on letter use. We also know that we can never begin a word with TCH, but I will never forget, I was at the Louisiana Speech and Hearing Conference in New Orleans, and I'm listening to Ken Oppel, who is a renowned linguist, SLP researcher, and speaks a lot about morphological awareness, which is the awareness of morphology, its influence on spelling and spelling rules. And he says you can never begin a word with TCH. And we slowly raise our hands across the room in New Orleans and we say, unless you're going to the Tchefuncte River, Tchefuncte. Or if we're going down Chapatula Street, TCH. And see, I'm having to visualize it inside out. Think it. Chapatulus. I'm not sure my vowels are wrong there. That OA doesn't look right. But Chapatulus and Tchefuncte, the Chapatula Street in New Orleans and the Tchefuncte River feeds into Lake Pontchartrain. So, yes, in most times we do not begin a word TCH. However, if we take into consideration the word of origin being that it was an American Indian word, then you can have those abnormal spellings. And that's what's so fun about this, about exploring the word origin and what it means and how we got to the point of where we are today and spelling it. But we do have permissible letter sequences and use. A double consonant must intervene between a stressed short vowel syllable and an inflected ending beginning with a vowel. Some letters are never used in final word positions, such as V and J. You're not going to end love, which is to V. You're always going to mark it with that silent E pattern. Same thing with the J. And then E acts as a relational unit and sometimes uses a marker, as it is used in the example I just gave of V, and sometimes in words that end in J. They're not going to end in J, they'll end in J, usually E, or if we're making the J sound in the word, we usually spell it DGE and GE. Additionally, we have syllable influence, so that helps explain spelling patterns and helps students recognize and recall longer printed words more efficiently, because we don't encounter only one syllable or two syllable words in reading. We encounter multi-syllabic words with influences from word origin, the position of the sounds in the words, and the syllabication. So we have a primary stress, we have a secondary stress, and sometimes we might even have a third stress, depending on how long the word is. So what are the types of syllable patterns? We have syllables that are organized around the vowel and the nucleus of the syllable. These are going to be the stressed syllables. We have closed syllables that essentially there's consonant vowel consonant type patterning. We have the vowel consonant E syllable stress, where we know that vowel is going to make that long sound, and there's usually stress that comes with the long sound, depending on how many syllables again are in the word. We have open syllables where they end in a vowel sound. Again, that has stress with it. You have vowel team syllables where the vowels act as a team, like the digraph vowel, the diphthong vowels O, I, being oi, and the digraphs like AW for aw. That's not a diphthong. A diphthong, your mouth does two positions, such as oi. A digraph is when there's two graphemes for one sound. Vowel team syllables are syllables with long, short, or diphthong vowel sounds that use a letter combination for spelling. We have the vowel R syllable rules, which is a single vowel letter followed by R, such as O-R, E-R, U-R, A-R, I-R. And the R influences the pronunciation of the vowel in front of it. And then we have the consonant -LE rule, which is an unaccented final syllable containing a single consonant L and silent E. So all of that is influencing the spelling of words when we're looking at how syllables occur. And again, syllables are organized around vowels, and the vowel is the nucleus of the syllable. And that was found on page 104 in table 4.6. Orthographic conventions. This occurs when double letters occur between syllables. So you always ever wonder, why am I doubling this consonant at the end to make it plural, or not plural, but to make it present progressive tense, or to make it past tense? Well, here is why. If it's a closed syllable, it must end in at least one consonant. And remember, if you're adding morphemes such as ing and ed, it could change the amount of syllables that you're having. So you need that syllable to remain closed. If the vowel of the first syllable is short, then the syllable will be closed and end in a consonant. If the first syllable is followed by a consonant LE, then a doubled consonant will result. And so if the first syllable is followed by a consonant LE, these examples are scrabble and little and goggle. Well, if you take out that double letter, it would read scrabble, lidle, goggle, goggle, because we don't have that double consonant to protect that short vowel. So the enunciation and the position is influencing that spelling. When the vowel is ambiguous in longer words, all right, so here's where we get to this multisyllabic words, and you have that schwa. In general, the VCV, vowel consonant vowel syllable juncture, is that essentially chance or 75% favors a long vowel pronunciation in the first syllable if you have a VCV in the first syllable. And this makes schwa happen though sometimes in the other 25%. So it's just essentially guesswork to know what whether it's going to be a schwa or not a schwa in a multisyllabic word. Okay, so is it vowel consonant vowel or is it vowel consonant vowel? Which is it going to make long vowel? Is it going to make short vowel? Is it going to make schwa? How do you help a student determine that? So first, you want to teach them these strategies. Locate and put a line under each vowel grapheme in the word. And then you want to box any familiar endings such as ing, es, ed. And then you want to circle any familiar beginning word parts like as re, ein, pre. You want to use knowledge of the syllable to decode vowel sounds. So you want to scoop the pencil under each syllable, blending the sounds left to right. So if you've broken each vowel into it, okay, so what consonants are going to go with that vowel to make a syllable? Say the whole word and see if it makes sense. See if it's a word you've ever heard before. And then you want to check the context for clarification. And of course, ask if you don't know. And so, like you might have this word, and I would say applicable, but I was at a workshop not too long ago, and someone was saying, if it's applicable, and she was changing her stress. And knowing that able is a morpheme, then we would not stress the able, applicable, because it's applying. But that makes that A become the schwa. But if you're not familiar with that, if you haven't heard it in context, then you might not know. So that's how you can teach a student to attack it and see if it makes sense. And of course, always ask for clarification. So what are 3 principles for dividing longer words? You have the vowel consonant, consonant vowel, which is when 2 consonants between words, such as those doubled consonants, like penny, napkin, subletter, the book examples. You have vowel consonant vowel and vowel consonant vowel, which is 1 consonant between 2 vowels, such as even, rabies, decent. Then you have consonant blends that usually stick together. So you know if you see TR together, that's probably going to stick together. SP is going to stick together. SL is going to stick together. ST. So of course, QU is always going to stick together as well. So if you're familiar with the blends, you know that they typically now stick together for syllabication. So finally, orthographic rules for adding suffixes. And we'll discuss this a little bit deeper when we get to morphology. But there are 3 rules governing addition of suffixes to base words. You have the consonant doubling rule, which I mentioned earlier, which is when a 1-syllable word with 1 vowel ends in 1 consonant. You have to double the final consonant before adding a suffix beginning with a vowel, or else it changes it to a long vowel sound instead of a short vowel. Then you have advanced consonant doubling. When a base word has more than 1 syllable, and if the final syllable is accented, it has 1 vowel followed by 1 consonant, then double the final consonant when adding an ending beginning with a vowel. And the examples the books use are inferred, permitted, embedded. So accent of the syllable is driving when it is doubled or whether it's not doubled. And just take a look. Let's look at inferred, or let's look at permitted. I think that would be. This is how we spell permitted. If you take out that double T, that looks like permitted, because the accent we know is on the final vowel sound, permit. So if you know how it's pronounced and where it's accented in its root form, then you should be able to understand the doubling rule for any added endings of suffixes. Then finally you have the drop silent E rule, and that's probably one of the few rules we definitely were taught when we were in school, is when to drop E and change it to Y. When a base word ends in a silent E, drop the E when adding a suffix beginning with a vowel. So drop E, add ing, drop E to add ed, and then S versus ES. And we always know change the Y to I. Automatically capitalized I. Change Y to I. When a root ends in a Y preceded by a consonant, change Y to I before a suffix, because it would change the meaning of the word. And we don't want two double I's together, because we know that can't happen. Like in try, if we are trying too hard, it would not look right if we spelled it like this. We have to spell it trying, even though typically we change that ending. So, is English predictable or is it unpredictable? Your general concept probably coming in was that English spelling makes no sense, but let's really analyze it. So the correspondence system used to spell the individual speech sounds and words is predictable to a great extent, as long as several factors are considered. We need to consider the position of a sound and word, the sounds that come before or after it in a given sound, which affects their stress and syllabication patterns, the letter sequences that English allows, and then the history of a word and the evolution of modern English. So those four components must be considered when you're looking at English orthography. English words cannot be divided into regular and irregular words. If you have a system that's only teaching those two methods as regular and irregular, then it's an insufficient system because it's much more complex than that. So what do we know about the predictability of the English spelling system? Again, this was another aha moment for me, because I always thought English spelling makes no sense whatsoever. You just have to memorize it and learn it based on the frequency of exposure. But that's not true. If we look at it, 50% or half of all English words are spelled accurately by sound symbol correspondence rule alone. All right, great. Half our words are. What do we do with the other half? 36% more are spelled with only one error. So there are variation, OI versus OY types of variations. 10% more are spelled accurately if word meaning, origin, and morphology are considered. So we went from 50, 36, that's 86. We went up to 96% of our words are spelled predictably if we consider primary and secondary spellings, sound symbol correspondence, word meaning, origin, and morphology. That means only 4%, fewer than 4%, are true oddity, and that's the example I used earlier, such as said. There are few words whose spellings were unique or truly unpredictable in the English language, and many of those are from our Anglo-Saxon roots, because again, we imposed this 26-letter alphabetic system onto a language that was much more complex and had probably more than 44 phonemes at the time, considering the elongation of the vowels. And so that's why we encounter these, what we see as problems when we are considering English orthography and teaching spelling. But it's all predictable. There's a reason for everything and why it's like that. You just have to have the linguistic knowledge to understand it. So, and we can move into now, spellings represent meaning or morphology as well as sound. So it's not just a sound-driven system, whereas many other languages are strictly sound-driven. We have sound-driven, and we also are driven by our meaning. And so we'll discuss that more next week when we get into morphology.